So I've been obsessed with history for a long time. And in my early years, that meant I worshipped the history that was taught to me in high school. Then I got to college, and my whole worldview was flipped on its head. See, it's no secret that history tends to favor the historians. And over the past century or so, the US Education Department and the French Education Department and many, many more Western education departments have made a conceded effort to magnify this effect even further. The Haitian Revolution is one of the true epics of history, filled with heroic leaders, daring battles, and maybe most importantly for our modern liberal era, a David and Goliath story of freedom fighters triumphing over a dictatorial regime. It has all the calling cards of an American synonym, at least within possibly uppity American academics who disregard some historically terrible American acts. Meaning, it should be all over high school history books alongside the American and French revolutions. But it's not. And this is that story of how the West has successfully covered up an epic story of Black empowerment in the Haitian Revolution.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon, and this because they do the other thing. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that challenge is hard that we're willing to.
Okay, but before we get into the video, it'd be a huge help if you dropped a like and subscribed. Not only does it help us understand what you guys want to see, it also helps us with the YouTube algorithm. Thanks. But first, before we cover the cover-up, let's get into actually what the Haitian Revolution was, just in case you don't know. First colonized by France and named Saint Dominique by the Treaty of the Republic in 1697, Haiti soon became the sugar capital of the slave trade. And by the late 1700s, specifically 1789, over 450,000 were enslaved on the island, compared to the much smaller free population of only 55,000. Oftentimes, young historians can mistake the Caribbean slave trade as being, quote, better than the American slave trade. This is actually just more than a problematic statement, it's plain wrong. Slavery in the Caribbean was brutal. Half of all Africans stole from their homes died within a few simple years on the island of disease, dysentery, or just overworking. And death by overworking, unfortunately, was not uncommon. Saint Dominique slavers were known to literally work the enslaved to death, disregarding humanity completely in the process. Then, on August 22nd, 1791, everything changed. Toussaint Louverture, a free Black Haitian, led over 100,000 people, torching plantations, dismantling sugar factories, and killing slave owners, all alongside the guidance of a Jamaican named Boukman Dutty. At first, Louverture took sides with the Spanish, after being promised a more direct leadership structure from the people, but in fear of losing their colony, in 1794, France abolished slavery, thus convincing Louverture to switch sides. And quickly after, Spain surrendered, and in 1799, Toussaint Louverture and Saint Dominique re-established a French government, this time with Black Haitians at the helm. Okay, in fairness, that did not do the Haitian Revolution nearly the justice it deserves, but I'll include some more thorough coverages in the description, and we can look into how the Western world covered up this revolution as promised. And to properly understand how these histories are taught today and covered up today, we will look not at America's education system, but the former colonizer of Haiti, France's education system. They also so happen to be an ideological twin to America, so it's not a bad comparison. In 2021, it is common for a very normal French student, having done well in school, to have not have heard much of Louverture or just the Haitian Revolution in general. And this is in spite of prominent political activist Marcus Garvey claiming that Toussaint's temperament as a politician and military commander was on par, if not surpassing, documented greats such as Washington and Napoleon. alongside the inescapable, hugely impactful fact that the Haitian Revolution inspired anti-colonial sentiments across the globe. Elizabeth Landy, a professor of history in Martinique, says that despite all this, quote, it's taught as if a minor story, not la grande histoire, or a massively important historical moment. But in fairness, this is a much larger issue than just the ignorance in France. The global world, as well as the historical community, are well aware of the greatness of the Haitian Revolution. So there are no excuses for what's happening in France today. In French metro vocational schools, much like American trade schools, students are taught that, quote, the Haitian Revolution as a singular extension of the American and French revolutions, unquote. This means the future working class will more deeply understand the heroics of Toussaint, as well as the epics of modern black history. It's still far from perfect, but still, the vocational curriculum recognizes the Haitian Revolution to have been both ideologically legitimate and from a noble cause, giving a less Eurocentric perspective to the moment. And this is all fantastic. Nowhere near perfect, but also not an abhorrent issue. This, however, counteracts sadly with the, quote, generaliste curriculum, or the curriculum of the future lawyers, professors, and lawmakers of France. So as said, the curriculum is built for the future high earners of France. And this vastly ambitious group may very well grow into young lawyers or lawmakers, yet still only viewing the emancipations of slaves in France not to be due to the Haitian Revolution, but instead citing the Second Republic's decree in 1848, so because of the, quote, goodwill of the French government. And to make an educated leap of faith, as YouTube allows me to do, I'm sorry, this is on purpose. See, liberal democracies are obsessed with their grand histories of being a liberal democracy. Thus, they find it excruciatingly difficult to admit past governmental evils or failures. And this is still backed up with unfortunate and completely real laws. In 2005, the French legislature passed a motion suggesting, quote, schools emphasize the positive role of colonialism. But there have been some efforts, such as in 2006, when then French President Jacques Chirac created a national day of commemoration for slavery, saying that, quote, too few French people know names, however they are part of the history of France, after speaking to the greatness of Louverture. And I mean, that's cool, but in 2020, main French curriculum still ignores the story of the Haitian Revolution, simply due to France not wishing to think about their history of white negligence, misogyny, colonization, and simply a general trend in France to limit the apparent scope of slavery played in building the nation. This specific point being quite prominent and pushed by certain French historians. And as of current political climates, France is cleanly split between Macron-type voters believing in dealing with the tragedies of the past and far-right voters wishing to ignore the past and endorse problematic politicians such as Jean-Michel Bocuse, the Ministry of Education, and someone who has gone on air advertising against dealing with the past, ignoring the histories of slavery completely. So again, France has time in and time out refused to include the Haitian Revolution in the education of their future leaders and high earners. And this is a culturally unstable thing to do going forward as the information era continues to reign supreme. So it stems from racism and dirty politics as well. If I had it all, history would be told straight up, but it's not. So sometimes it becomes our own job to self-educate and expand our own horizons before we possibly join masses with horse blinders to whitewash their history. And for the future of us all, we better get educated and find solutions.